Pless. I'm the Farm to School Director here at Guidestone, Colorado in sunny Salida. And today we're going to talk for our High Altitude Garden Series class both about how to build raised bed gardens and about how to prepare your beds for planting, whether they're in a raised bed or whether they're in the ground. This is a new site for us to be doing these Facebook Live videos. We are here at the school garden for the Salida Middle School. So this garden has been going for over 10 years. So it's we have some older raised beds. We've been starting to put in some new raised beds, and we've had some time to try out different techniques here to see what works. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is why you might want to build a raised bed and why you wouldn't just go right into the soil. And so some of it is that some people find it's more comfortable to work in a raised bed. I can kneel and be right at a nice, comfortable place to work here, so I don't have to bend over all the time. For people who have more limited mobility, that can be really important. It's really great for working with volunteer groups or kids because it's really clear to see where the beds are and where they aren't, and so where they should be walking and running in the garden. It also can be really great if you have any concerns about the health of your soil. So one place that I worked, we had some lead contamination in some of the soils in the neighborhood. And so if we put down a raised bed and put clean soil into that, we knew that we were growing in healthy soil that would grow healthy vegetables to keep us healthy. So those are some of the reasons. And also sometimes people just feel like they look really nice. Some places that soil will also thaw faster in the spring, so you can get an earlier start on some things. And I've done a lot of growing in in-ground and a lot of growing in raised beds, and they both work pretty well. So I'm going to talk about two different kinds of raised beds. In this garden, we mostly have raised beds that are framed with wood. This is one of them. You can sort of see it's about a 12 by 4 foot raised bed. And so the 4 foot is nice because if we think about trying to reach to the middle of the raised bed, you don't want it to be much wider than 4 feet. I've done a lot of 3 foot gardens. That's what we have at the elementary school because we're working with kids who are smaller, and so they have less of a reach. But if I think about trying to reach over and do things in the middle of the bed, if I can access it from both sides, I probably want it to be no more than 4 feet wide. Where we're designing beds for our dome, we have a bunch of dome beds that are on the perimeter of the dome, so we can only access it from one side, so we keep those to 3 feet so that we don't have to stretch so far and don't have to really hurt our backs. When we think about materials, there's a lot of different materials you can use to build a raised bed. With wood, one of the concerns is that wood is in contact with often wet soil, and so it can rot pretty quickly. So for organic standards, you can't use treated lumber because there's concerns that some of those chemicals that treat it could leach into the soil and be taken up into the food and the produce. So for organic standards, you would use cedar because it's a naturally rot resistant wood. That's one option. You can see that these were previously painted or stained to try and help them weather. We have pretty strong winds, as you can hear probably, and really bright sunlight, and so trying to paint them on the outside with some kind of food safe paint is really, it's important that it is sort of food safe. The other option that we did last year, as we were starting to have some of these beds start to break down after they've been used for so long, is we did a partnership with one of the woodshop classes at Salida High School, and they made a form to pour concrete into. So these beds, these are essentially never going to rot, right? So each of the panels is 4 feet wide, and they have sort of a lip that sticks out on one side and a notch on the other so that they fit together. And then there's, they put into the concrete as they poured it, these straight tubes, sort of empty metal conduit rods, so that they are held together with these pieces of rebar that stay there. So last year what we did, some with some of the students at Salida Middle School and Salida High School, and some with some of our Guidestone summer garden camps, is we emptied all the soil out of one of the beds where the wood was breaking down, and we cleared it all out, and we laid down, these beds have had plastic in them at the bottom to try and help keep the moisture levels in since it's so dry here, and to help keep grass and weeds from growing up inside them. You can also use landscape fabrics. You could also use cardboard. Cardboard will eventually break down, but it's a more natural way to do it. So we emptied all the soil out onto a tarp. We took apart our previous bed, we put in the new bed, and put down the plastic again, and then put all the soil back in here. So we did the bed that's sort of back closest to the shed last summer, and it was one of our best beds at producing, especially tomatoes and peppers. And I think part of that is that the concrete helps to hold that heat in from the day all the way through the night, and that's what helps to make sure that we have like productive peppers and tomatoes and some of those really frost tender crops that really like it warm. They like really warm evenings. So those are two ways that you can build a raised bed. If you are going to do it with wood, we use these corner brackets on the inside, and we teach the kids and the students, the campers and the students, how to use a little cordless drill to screw these in or take them out. You can also see that halfway across the bed there's a piece of wood that goes across so that the pressure of the weight of the soil isn't going to push out the sides of the beds. You can do raised beds out of a lot of other things as well. Most of the time I've seen them sort of up to about 2 to maybe the max 3 feet tall. A lot of times I'll just do a raised bed that's like just 1 2x10, so it just lifts it just a little bit off the ground. We'll look in a second at, we also have a few raised beds that are just edged with rocks here, as well as at the farm. At the community and school farm, because that land is so wet, we have a very high water table there. That's another reason that we built the raised beds there, is to lift the plants up out of the soil so they wouldn't be waterlogged. When you are going to fill a raised bed, we will sometimes get soil ourselves from Brady's here in Salida, or from Salida Greenhouse. They both sell different soil mixes. Sometimes I will try and build up my soil myself. So if you did do that, want to do that with like the concrete beds, you could do what's called lasagna gardening, where you lay down a layer of cardboard, and then you put down some compost, some finished compost, or if you have enough time before the next season, you could put down some unfinished compost and let it like sort of break down, and so that in the end you'd have really rich soil, and then another layer of cardboard and some more soil. And then if you have cardboard on the top or very close to the top and you want to plant through it, you can literally just use a utility knife to cut a hole in that cardboard and plant right through it into the compost that's underneath it, so that top layer of cardboard will help to keep down the weeds as well. The campers last summer at this garden did an experiment, because there are different colors of plastic mulch. You can let the same idea of the cardboard is you can lay down plastic, and I've used like contractor bags when I didn't have, like on a farm you get these huge rolls of plastic. We had heard that tomatoes do best under red plastic, and I got 20 feet of free red plastic, and we tried it on bare soil, black plastic, and red plastic, and we actually found that the tomatoes grew the most under the black plastic. So you're always welcome to do a little experiment and let us know also what works best for you with your raised beds. So we're going to shift to talking a little bit about bed prep, but first we're going to turn right around and look, hopefully not too directly into the sun, at this raised bed right here. So this one you can see is a much shallower raised bed. It's just slightly raised, and then it's sort of kept in place with the rocks. We'll do another session on setting up simple irrigation systems, but that's a big thing to remember here, is that as you're building a raised bed, that you're thinking about, how am I going to incorporate a regular watering system into this? Whether it's irrigation, or are you really committed to going out there with a watering can every day to make sure that your plants do well? So we'll go this way. Over here at the end of this concrete raised bed that we put in last fall, we had a little bit of extra room, so we did a lower raised bed just like over there that's just edged with rock. have a bunch of onions that are growing in there. All right, so when you're doing bed preparation, if you are going into sod, I would recommend putting down a layer of cardboard or something to help block that grass from coming up. You will eventually get, over the years, some grass that grows through there anyway. And this is definitely, for me, the best time to get rid of that grass because it's going to be much harder to weed around existing transplants. So I try and do whatever kind of weeding I can do before I get any further. And then I don't have a fork here. I don't have a fork here. But if I had a fork, I like to try and aerate the soil. So over the course of the year, and even over the course of the winter, if you think about like heavy rains can come back the soil, or especially if you're not growing in a raised bed and you're growing somewhere in your garden, and you've been out running around and haven't been paying attention to where the bed is and where the path is, that soil can be really compacted. And then it doesn't have it needs a little more aeration for those microbes to like wake up and get ready for the spring and get ready to really support the health of your plants. So with a shovel or with a fork, what I'm trying to do is not turn over and invert the soil layers, but just pull back a little bit so that I'm like pushing down, I can step down, and then I'm just pulling back just a little bit so that a little bit more air can get down into that soil. We're loosening up and sort of fluffing it. And that also will make it easier for water to infiltrate the soil as well, so that we're not just watering and having all the water come off the end. Once we have an area that is all clear of weeds and we have forked it or aerated it, we can take a rake and we can try and make it really nice and smooth. If you are sowing things directly from seed, it's even more important for it to be really nice and smooth. If you are transplanting already starter plants, you can get away with it being a little bit bumpier. One thing I like to do with this kind of rake is that after I've gotten it as smooth as I can get it, I flip the rake over and I go over it again, and it somehow makes it even smoother. And so then if I am gonna seed with a seeder, that can be really nice. If I'm not gonna seed with a seeder and I just wanna seed by hand, sometimes I'll just draw the line right with the end of my tool so that I have a nice line. Another little trick you can do is you can get really narrow pieces of PVC or some kind of tubing and put 3 on your rake, and then they stick out longer, so when you rake it, it makes 3 parallel lines. And so you can do that so that it's sized so you could get a hula hoe in between, or just so that it looks really nice and neat and you know that everything is spaced nicely. Sometimes I will draw the lines for my transplants as well for the same reason, so that I know I can come back through with a hula hoe or some other weeding tool and get all of the weeds that are growing in between my plants without knocking into my plants themselves. The last thing I was going to say about bed preparation is, and I usually do this after I transplant, but you can also do it before, you can add a bunch of straw mulch, or I have used leaves. This is a pretty windy place for leaves, or wood chips to try and help. They really help to like shade the soil, so it helps to keep the soil cooler, it helps to keep down weeds, it helps to keep more of the moisture in the soil, and it looks really nice. And so we try and use as much straw mulch as we can, or wood chips. We just got a bunch of wood chips at the end of last season that we're working our way through. Like I said, leaves work all right if you can get them in a place if you're not in too much wind. So if you have a nice tall deer fence like you need here in Salida that doesn't let wind through it, then leaves might be a good idea. But otherwise, wood chip mulch or something like that, or you can, it doesn't look as pretty, but you can also definitely layer down like pieces of cardboard in between and either pin them down or weight them down with rocks so they don't blow away. And that really can help to make sure that you have really healthy transplants. The last thing I was going to say, which I would do before I mulch, but I lost track of it, is what kind of things you want to do to amend your soil. So, you know, I talked a little bit about like there's places in town where you can go buy new soil. But there's also times where, like, if you've been growing in this soil, like in this garden for years and years, we have to keep giving back to the soil. If you think about how all those nutrients that are in the carrots and broccoli and peas that we eat, a lot of those are like minerals or micronutrients that once we take them out to eat them, then that was what the plant had already gotten from the soil. So we have to remember to like keep refreshing our soil. We can do that through cover cropping, which is growing plants that we just turn back under to put back into the soil. One of the easiest ones to do in a garden for a cover crop is buckwheat, because it goes through its whole life cycle in about 8 weeks. It is frost tender, so you can't do it until we don't have frost anymore at night. But it is also really easy to just like, you can literally run on it. In fact, we had a big buckwheat stomping party at the farm a couple years ago, and smash it down and then just leave it there as like its own straw mulch. You can also get different amendments like compost, and this is another big plug for if you're growing in, if you're starting your garden, it's great to send off a soil sample to Colorado State University Extension or another soil testing lab to find out what you need for your soil, because all those micronutrients and macronutrients need to be in balance, and so then you know you're amending with the right stuff. Brady's and Salida Greenhouse also sell soil conditioners and compost, and we get a lot of our compost at the farm from Elements Mountain Compost with Julie Mock here in town. So getting some compost will really help as well, along with then adding that mulch. And the other thing that mulch helps to do, especially if it's like a straw mulch or an organic mulch, like some kind of organic material, like whether it's like grass clippings or wood chips or leaves, that does eventually start to break down and it builds up more organic matter in your soil, so it gives you healthier soil as well. We do a lot of these same techniques on when we're growing in the ground. So the same thing, I will go through and I'll fork everything. We have a broad fork, which is about this wide, which is about as wide as our bed. So a lot of times we'll broad fork everything to loosen up that compaction. We'll add any compost we're gonna add. We'll rake it in. If we have a lot of annual weeds instead of these, the dandelion and the grass that I took out of here are perennial weeds. I feel like I almost have to pull those by hand. If you have annual weeds, they'll be super tiny, and you can use a hula hoe going back and forth to just get them up, dry out their roots, and then you have a clean seed bed to plant it to. The last thing I'm going to say, which isn't quite bed preparation, but it's good preparation if you're going to start planting, is to see about getting a little bit of row cover. They sell this at Brady's and Salida Greenhouse and at Ace, but this is a pretty thick one. But if you put your plants out and it's a really windy day or really hot, you can put this down either just loose or over hoops if you have taller plants, and that will offer some frost protection. It helps to protect the plants from the wind, and it helps to keep some of that moisture in and keep it a little bit more constant temperature. If you have a late frost that comes around that you really weren't expecting and you didn't buy any row cover, I have totally used bed sheets. I don't recommend using them very long because then all your bed sheets are dirty, but you know, desperate times called for desperate measures. And the important things about these are that it's breathable and water goes through it, so I can still water through it. Although I usually try and check and make sure that the water is actually getting to everywhere I want to get to if I'm watering through it with a hose. That's it for this week. So we hope to see you again next week. I hear that there's one question.
What do you have in terms of tips for bindweed that overtakes?
Oh, bindweed. I'm all ears for tips for bindweed. My tips for bindweed are to like dig down and get as much of the root as possible. And I generally try to compost everything. Bindweed is one of those that, like, my idea of composting it is throwing it into a plastic bag and leaving it out all summer, and maybe thinking about putting it in a place where I'm not going to grow vegetables when I do empty the bag, after I'm really sure it's really dead. I don't really have a lot of good solutions to bindweed. I have heard, and this is a long time ago, that there was some kind of mite that you could get from extension for bindweed. It's not something I've ever tried because bindweed is in the same family as sweet potatoes and morning glories, and so because I'd like to grow sweet potatoes, I don't know if that mite would ever move over to sweet potatoes. And for me, I'd rather just deal with the bindweed than unleash something that I'm not really sure what kind of unintended consequences it would have. I wish I had a better answer, but if anybody hears anything good about bindweed, let me know. My other thought, and this is completely, I've never tried this, but because it is related to sweet potatoes, I've often wondered if you could get, if you brought in some pigs, if they would root it all up. That might be a harder thing to do in your home garden. So, and I haven't tried it, so I'll have to ask a pork farmer first. Any other questions? All right, we'll hope to see you guys next week. Happy gardening.